She whispered, "It bleeds when I sit." The town shunned her, but one man believed her. Welcome to Dusk Tales. Let's uncover what really happened. The wind that scraped across the dust bowl was a razor, sharp and relentless, carving new lines of sorrow into the land and the faces of those who dared to remain. It carried the ghosts of failed crops and the grit of shattered hopes. For Abigail Hayes, the wind was a constant sermon on the nature of desolation. It had been a year since it had carried the scent of freshly turned earth from her husband's grave, a year since the world had shrunk to the four walls of her small, isolated homestead and the gnawing silence within. She was a widow at 24, a fact the town of Deliverance acknowledged with the same tight-lipped pity they reserved for drought and locusts, an unfortunate but unavoidable act of God. But it was not her grief that had made her an outcast. It was the affliction she carried in the quiet, hidden sanctuary of her own body. It was a wound from a difficult childbirth that had taken her son before he could draw his first breath, a wound that refused to heal, a constant, weeping reminder of all she had lost. It was a secret pain, one that made sitting for any length of time an agony, one that forced her to stand through the long, condemning sermons at the town church, her posture a silent, unintentional act of defiance that the good folk of Deliverance mistook for pride. The whispers had started then. They saw her standing at the back of the church, her face pale, and they did not see a woman in pain. They saw a woman who thought herself too good to kneel. They saw her shift her weight from foot to foot and saw not discomfort, but a restless, ungodly spirit. The whispers coiled and spread, fed by the town's matriarch of piety, Mrs. Blackwood, a woman whose righteousness was as starched and unforgiving as her high-collar dresses. It was to the town doctor, a man with whiskey on his breath and impatience in his eyes, that Abigail had finally confessed her shame. "It bleeds when I sit," she had whispered, the words of surrender, a plea for help. The doctor had given her a dismissive pat on the hand, a bottle of laudanum, and, she would later realize, a story to tell. He had shared her confidence with his wife, who had shared it with the sewing circle, and soon, Abigail's private agony became public spectacle. She was no longer just the proud widow. She was the bleeding woman, a creature of some unspoken, unclean malady, a walking, breathing embodiment of shame. The shunning was not a formal decree. It was a slow, creeping frost. The invitations to quilting bees stopped. The women at the general store would fall silent when she entered, their eyes sliding away from hers. Children were pulled back from her path, as if she were a leper. She was isolated, adrift on a sea of righteous condemnation, her small homestead an island of pain. She was at her lowest point, her spirit as eroded as the dry creek bed that ran behind her house. The loneliness was a physical weight, pressing down on her day and night. She had begun to believe what they whispered about her, that she was cursed, that she was unclean, that she deserved this solitary suffering. On a Tuesday, under a sky the color of old iron, she forced herself to make the long walk to town for flour. The pain was a hot, sharp thing, and she had to stop several times, leaning against a fence post, her breath coming in ragged gasps. As she reached the edge of town, the world began to waver, the edges blurring into a gray haze. She stumbled, her legs giving out from under her, and collapsed into the thick dust of a road, the world finally dissolving into a welcome, painless black. She did not see the man who watched her fall. He had been mending a fence line on the far ridge, a solitary figure against the vast, empty sky. He had seen her struggle, had seen her fall. He stood for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he left his work and began the long walk down into the valley. He was not a man who sought out the company or the troubles of others. But he was also not a man who could leave a fallen creature to the mercy of the dust. His name was Silas Kane, and he was about to walk into the quiet, desperate war of Abigail Hayes. The first thing Abigail was aware of was the scent of wood smoke and pine. The second was the absence of pain. She was lying on something soft, a thick wool blanket covering her, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the hot, sharp agony in her body had receded to a dull, distant ache. She opened her eyes slowly. She was not in her own small, sparse cabin. She was in a room built of rough-hewn logs, the spaces between them chinked with dried moss. A fire crackled in a large stone hearth, its light casting a warm, gentle glow on the walls. The room was simple, masculine, yet immaculately clean. A rifle rested on 2 pegs above the mantelpiece. A small stack of books sat on a crude but well-made table. A man sat in a chair by the fire, his back to her, sharpening a large hunting knife with slow, steady strokes. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair tied back at the nape of his neck. He wore a simple, worn leather vest over a flannel shirt. He seemed utterly at ease in the silence, a part of the quiet strength of the room itself. Abigail pushed herself up, a small gasp escaping her lips as a twinge of the old pain returned. The man stopped his work. He turned his head slowly, and his eyes met hers. They were the color of a stormy sea, deep and unreadable, and they held no surprise, no pity, no judgment. He simply looked at her, his gaze steady and assessing. "Where am I?" Abigail asked, her voice a dry whisper. "My cabin," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. "You collapsed on the road. I brought you here." She looked around the room again, her mind struggling to catch up. She remembered the dust, the pain, the suffocating darkness. "How long?" "Just since yesterday," he said. He stood and walked to the hearth, stoking the fire. His movements were economical and sure, the movements of a man long accustomed to solitude. He ladled something from a pot hanging over the fire into a wooden bowl. He brought it to her. It was a thin, fragrant broth. "You need to eat," he said. It was not a request. She took the bowl, her hands trembling slightly. She drank the broth. It was warm and nourishing, and she could feel the strength of it seeping in her tired bones. He watched her, his expression unchanging. "Who are you?" she asked when the bowl was empty. "Silas," he said simply. He took the empty bowl from her and returned to his chair by the fire, picking up his knife and sharpening stone as if the conversation were over. Abigail studied him. He was a man who lived on the fringes, she could tell. His clothes were worn but clean, his hands callous from hard labor. He was a creature of the mountains and the woods, not the small, suffocating society of the town. She noticed that the chair he had offered her by the bed was padded with a thick, folded sheepskin, making it soft and forgiving. And she realized, with a jolt, that he had not asked her a single question. He had not asked her name, where she came from, or why a woman would collapse alone on a dusty road. He had seen her need, and he had met it, simply and without judgment. This absence of curiosity was a greater kindness than any she had known in years. She lay back against the pillows, her body still weak, but her spirit feeling a strange, unfamiliar sense of peace. The fire crackled, the wind soughed in the pines outside, and the man named Silas continued his quiet, rhythmic work. For the first time in a very long time, Abigail was not alone in her pain. And in the quiet, respectful silence of this stranger's cabin, she felt the first, tentative stirring of a hope she had thought long dead. She was safe here. For now. The days in Silas's cabin bled into one another, a quiet, healing blur. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke a language of profound, practical kindness. He never asked about her ailment, but he seemed to understand it with an intuitive grace. He brought her meals on a tray so she could eat in bed. He kept a steady supply of a bitter but effective herbal tea by her side, a concoction he said his late wife used to make for pain. He moved with a quiet, unobtrusive presence, tending to his chores, hunting for their food, and maintaining a respectful distance that was, in itself, a form of care. Abigail, for her part, slowly began to heal. The rest, the nourishing food, and the absence of the constant, grinding effort of survival, worked as slow magic on her battered body and spirit. The pain began to recede, its sharp edges softening into a manageable ache. She found herself watching Silas as he worked. He was a man in complete harmony with his environment. He moved through the forest with a silent, confident grace, his knowledge of the land deep and instinctual. He could read the weather in the shape of the clouds, tell the time by the slant of the sun, and find food where she saw only wilderness. He was, she realized, the most capable man she had ever known. A quiet bond began to form between them, woven from shared silences and small, unspoken gestures. She would mend a tear in his shirt, her neat, precise stitches a stark contrast to his own rough repairs. He, in turn, would leave a small, perfectly carved wooden animal on her bedside table in the morning. A hawk, a deer, a bear, each one a small, beautiful offering. One afternoon, as she felt strong enough to walk around the cabin, her gaze fell upon a small, faded photograph on the mantelpiece. It was of a woman with a kind, open face and a baby in her arms. Silas's wife and child. He entered the cabin as she was looking at it. He didn't speak, but stood beside her, his gaze also on the photograph. Her name was Mary, he said at last, his voice thick with an old, unhealed grief. The baby, we called him Samuel. What happened? Abigail asked softly. A blizzard, he said, his voice flat. I was away, trapping in the high country. I was gone too long. When I came back, he didn't need to finish. The story was there in the haunted depths of his eyes. I built this cabin for her, he continued, his voice a near whisper. I thought I could keep them safe here, away from the world. But the world finds you, no matter how far you run. In his story, Abigail heard the echo of her own. They were two survivors, two souls shipwrecked by grief, who had washed up on the same lonely shore. The shared knowledge of their losses created a new, deeper intimacy between them. The silence was no longer just comfortable, it was communion. But the world, as Silas had said, always finds you. One morning, a rider appeared at the edge of the clearing. It was Sheriff Brody, his horse and his posture equally weary. He had been sent by Mrs. Blackwood. Abigail's week-long absence had not gone unnoticed, and the town's gossip had festered, turning her disappearance into a new, more sinister scandal. The sheriff looked from Silas's imposing figure to Abigail, standing in the doorway of the cabin, looking healthier and stronger than he had ever seen her. His narrow mind immediately leaped to the conclusion the town had already drawn. Abigail, he said, his voice a mixture of accusation and embarrassment. There's been concern. Mrs. Blackwood and the church committee asked me to come looking for you. As you can see, Sheriff, I am quite all right, Abigail said, her voice cool and steady. What are you doing here with him? The sheriff pressed, gesturing to Silas with a nervous flick of his head. Mr. Kane has been a good neighbor to me, she said, her use of the formal Mr. a deliberate protective shield. I was unwell. He offered me shelter. The sheriff's eyes narrowed with suspicion. Folks are saying things, Abigail. It's not proper a woman like you, alone out here with a man who has shown me more Christian charity than your entire town combined, she finished, her voice sharp with a fire the sheriff had never heard from her. He flinched, taken aback by her sudden strength. Now, see here, he stammered. I'm just trying to keep the peace. Mrs. Blackwood says you need to come back to town. There's talk of revoking the deed to your property, on grounds of abandonment and moral vagrancy. It was a threat, plain and simple. Jedediah Kane, no doubt, was behind it, using Mrs. Blackwood's piety as his weapon. You can tell Mrs. Blackwood and Mr. Kane. Silas's voice cut in, low and dangerous, making the sheriff jump, that Mrs. Hayes is under my protection. And this land, he gestured to the surrounding forest, is under my watch. You're not welcome here. Leave. There was no arguing with the cold, final authority in his voice. The sheriff, red-faced and flustered, turned his horse and retreated, a defeated soldier from a battle he had not been prepared to fight. The confrontation had shattered their fragile peace. The town was no longer just shunning them. It was actively moving against them. That evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in fiery, defiant streaks, Abigail and Silas stood outside the cabin. The air was tense, charged with the certainty of the coming conflict. We can't stay here, Abigail said, her voice heavy. They won't stop until they've driven us out. No, Silas said, his gaze fixed on the distant, hazy lights of the town. We can't stay here, but we're not running, either. He turned to her, his stormy eyes holding a new, determined light. "Your husband was a good man, Abigail. He built that homestead with his own hands. He would not want you to surrender it to vultures. We're going back, and we're going to fight them." "How, Silas?" she asked, a sliver of her old despair returning. "They own the town. They own the law. We have something they don't," he said, a grim smile touching his lips for the first time. "We have the truth, and we have nothing left to lose." He reached out and took her hand, his strong, warm fingers closing around hers. It was a promise, a pledge. They were no longer two solitary survivors. They were force, and they were going to bring the fight for their lives and their honor back to the heart of deliverance. The return to the homestead was a declaration of war. Silas rode beside Abigail, his rifle resting easy in the crook of his arm, his presence a silent, formidable challenge to the prying eyes of the valley. They did not sneak back under the cover of darkness. They rode in the broad, unforgiving light of day, their two figures a stark, defiant statement against the backdrop of the plains. The homestead, when they arrived, felt both familiar and alien. It had been neglected for only a week, but in that time, the valley had tried to reclaim it. Weeds had begun to creep back into the small garden. Dust had settled in a thick layer on the windows, and nailed to the front door, stark and white, was an official-looking notice from the town council, citing a litany of newly invented bylaws she had supposedly violated, and demanding her presence at a town meeting to determine the fate of her property. It was a summons to her own execution. Silas tore the notice from the door and crumpled it in his fist. "They want a meeting," he said, his voice a low growl. "We'll give them one." For the next 2 days, they worked. It was not a frantic preparation, but a steady, purposeful one. Silas, using the tools from Abigail's late husband's workshop, began to reinforce the small cabin. He replaced the flimsy latch on the door with a heavy iron bolt he forged himself in the smithy's dying fire. He shuttered the windows, leaving small, defensible slits to see through. He was turning her small, vulnerable home into a fortress. Abigail, meanwhile, did what she had always done. She baked. She filled the small cabin with a warm, life-affirming scent of bread. It was her own act of defiance, a statement that this was a house of life, not of fear. She also took out her husband's old ledger, a book filled with his neat, precise handwriting detailing every transaction, every agreement, every promise made and kept in the founding of their small farm. In the quiet solidarity of their work, the last of the walls between them crumbled. They moved around each other with an easy, unspoken intimacy, their partnership as solid and reliable as the stone walls of the house. The fear that had been Abigail's constant companion was replaced by a cold, clear resolve. She was no longer a victim of the town's judgment. She was a woman defending her home, her husband's legacy, and the new, fragile hope that had taken root in her heart. The day of the town meeting arrived, the sky a high, unforgiving blue. The entire town of Deliverance had gathered in the church, the only building large enough to hold them. It was not a meeting, it was a tribunal. Jedediah Kane and Mrs. Blackwood sat at the front, near the pulpit, their faces masks of grim, self-righteous authority. Sheriff Brody stood nervously by the door. Abigail walked into that hostile room with Silas at her side. A wave of hostile murmurs rippled through the crowd. She did not flinch. She held her head high, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the people who had judged her, whispered about her, and cast her out. She saw not monsters, but small, frightened people, hiding their own insecurities behind a wall of judgment. The meeting began. Kane spoke first, his voice smooth and reasonable, painting a picture of a concerned community trying to uphold its moral standards. He spoke of Abigail's unfortunate situation, her reclusive nature, and the unseemly presence of a stranger on her land. He spoke of the need to protect the town from unstable elements. Mrs. Blackwood followed, her voice sharp and piercing, quoting scripture about fallen women and the dangers of consorting with outsiders. She spoke of Abigail's defiance in church, her pride, her shame. It was a well-orchestrated performance, designed to whip the crowd into a fervor of righteous indignation. When it was Abigail's turn to speak, a heavy silence fell over the room. She walked to the front, not to the pulpit, but to the center of the floor, so she was surrounded by them. She did not raise her voice. She did not plead. She simply told the truth. "You have judged me," she began, her voice clear and strong. "You have whispered about my grief and my pride. You have condemned me for an affliction you do not understand." She paused, her gaze sweeping over their faces. "You see me as a widow, alone and weak. But you do not see me at all. You see only your own fears." Then she turned her gaze on Mrs. Blackwood. "You speak of Christian charity, ma'am, but you have shown me none. You have used my pain as a weapon to bolster your own piety." She then looked at Jedediah Kane. "And you, sir, you speak of community standards, but you're not interested in the community. You're interested in my water. You have tried to starve me out, to intimidate me, to steal the land my husband and I built with our own two hands. Is that the standard of this community?" She took out her husband's ledger. "My husband kept records of every deal, including the one where he refused to sell his water rights to you, Mr. Kane, including the notes about your attempt to divert the creek upstream from his property." Kane's face went pale. The ledger was a record, a history, a truth he could not deny. But it was Silas who delivered the final, killing blow. He stepped forward, his presence filling the room. He did not speak of land or water. He spoke of Abigail. "I found this woman collapsed on a road, left to die by the town that now presumes to judge her," he said, his voice a low, powerful rumble. "Her only crime was her suffering. I took her in because it was the decent thing to do, a concept that seems to be in short supply in this valley." He then looked directly at the crowd. "You have cast stones at this woman for her weakness, but I have lived in her home. I have seen her strength. She has endured more pain than any of you could imagine, and she has done so with a grace and a dignity you will never possess. She is not the one who is unclean here. You are." The silence that followed his words was absolute, profound, and damning. The townspeople looked at each other, at their hands, at the floor. They saw the truth in his words, and they saw the ugliness of their own actions reflected in his clear, unwavering gaze. The meeting dissolved. People began to file out of the church, their faces flushed with a shame that was long overdue. Kane and Mrs. Blackwood were left sitting alone at the front, their power broken, their hypocrisy laid bare for all to see. The war was over, and they had won. Abigail and Silas walked out of that church and into the bright sunlight, hand in hand. The wind that blew through the valley that afternoon felt different. It was no longer a lament for what was lost. It was a song of a new beginning. The quiet revolution in deliverance did not happen overnight, but it was as inexorable as the turning of the seasons. The public shaming in the church had fractured the town's rigid hierarchy. Jedediah Kane's power, built on a foundation of fear and intimidation, began to crumble. Men who had once been afraid to cross him now found the courage to demand fair prices for their crops. Families he had pushed to the brink of foreclosure found their loans mysteriously restructured by a suddenly compliant bank manager. The fear he had wielded as a weapon had lost its edge. Mrs. Blackwood, stripped of her moral authority, retreated into the bitter silence of her large, empty house, her reign of pious tyranny at an end. For Abigail and Silas, life on the homestead became their sanctuary. The world they built together was small, but it was strong, its foundations laid in mutual respect and a deep, abiding love. Silas, using his formidable skills, expanded the small cabin, adding a new room for Abigail's bakery and a wide, shaded porch where they could sit in the evenings. The homestead was no longer just a place of survival. It was a place of thriving. Abigail's bakery, once a symbol of her isolation, became the new heart of the community. People began to come not just for her bread, but for her presence. They would linger, drawn by the warmth of her oven and the quiet, non-judgmental strength in her eyes. She would listen to their troubles, offering a kind word, a cup of coffee, and the simple, profound comfort of a shared slice of warm bread. She, who had been so cruelly cast out, had become the town's unlikely confessor, its healer. Her own physical ailment, in the safety and peace of her new life, began to heal. The constant, grinding pain receded, replaced by a quiet strength she had forgotten she possessed. She still had days of discomfort, but they no longer defined her. She was no longer the bleeding woman. She was Abigail, the baker, a woman of grace and resilience. She and Silas were a perfect partnership. His quiet strength was the bedrock upon which she rebuilt her life. Her gentle spirit was the balm that soothed the old, haunted wounds in his soul. They were married in the spring, in a simple ceremony on their newly built porch, with the entire, transformed town in attendance. Abigail wore a simple white dress and a crown of wildflowers. Silas, in a clean shirt and his best leather vest, looked at his bride with a reverence that was a prayer in itself. The child who had been lost, the wife who had been mourned, they were not forgotten. They were honored in the quiet, profound joy of this new beginning. They had found in each other not a replacement for what they had lost, but a new reason to live, a new definition of family. Years passed. The town of Deliverance, once a place of harsh judgment, became known for its quiet tolerance and its good bread. Travelers passing through would speak of the small homestead at the edge of the valley, of the kind-eyed woman who ran the bakery and the tall, silent man who was always by her side. They would speak of the feeling of peace that seemed to settle over the valley, a peace that was as real and tangible as the warm, fragrant loaves that came from Abigail's oven. One evening, an elderly Abigail and Silas sat on their porch, watching the sun set behind the jagged peaks. A small child, their grandson, played in the yard, his laughter bright in the twilight air. Silas took Abigail's hand, his touch as familiar and comforting as her own breath. "Do you remember the day I found you on the road?" he asked, his voice a low, contented rumble. "I remember the silence," she replied softly, "and the fear. I remember the strength," he said. "Even then, I saw it in you." She leaned her head on his shoulder, the gesture a lifetime of love and trust distilled into a single, simple movement. The wind that came down from the canyons that evening was gentle. It no longer carried the ghosts of sorrow and loss. It carried the scent of baking bread, of blooming wildflowers, and of a peace that had been hard-won and was, therefore, all the more precious. It was the wind of a place that had finally, truly lived up to its name. The pain had not been a curse. It had been a crucible, and from its fires, a woman, a man, and an entire town had been forged anew, stronger and more beautiful than before.